Beneath Greenland's ice is a buried city with a nuclear heart, and the waste was never removed. As the ice thins, that secret is rising toward the light. Locals still talk about bells heard under glaciers. Scientists talk about diesel, PCBs, and plutonium sealed in tunnels. The ice is starting to crush. Two echoes, myth and fallout, closing in on the present at the same time. This island swallowed whole cultures, the Sakak, the Dorset, the Norse, then buried a Cold War plan called Iceworm. Now a new race for the minerals under the rock could tilt global power. In this video, we track Greenland's story from its first known settlers around 2500 BCE to the battles unfolding today. To understand the danger, we go back to the first footprints. Start at a coast where driftwood is gold. Around 250 BCE, the Sakak stepped off small boats onto gravel beaches and built a life out of bone, stone, and wind. They brought microblades chipped from chert and obsidian, hafted into slotted handles like a detachable saw. No forests here, so every plank came from far-off rivers, carried by currents, found and treasured. Seal-breathed steam through cracks and winter ice. A thrust, a line, a meal. Survival was timing. Stakes were simple and brutal. Miss the migration and you starved. Hit it, and a year could be banked in hides, sinew, lamps, and meat. In a turf shelter, a soapstone lamp burned seal fat, throwing a steady yellow flame. Months of night pressed against the walls. Inside, hand-stitched parkas with bone needles finer than a toothpick. That lamp, it's the heart of the Arctic. Lose it, and you lose everything. Centuries later, the Dorset arrived, artists of silence. They carved polar bears that looked alive and masked fragments with staring eyes. Here's the mystery. They didn't use the bow and arrow, even though neighbors elsewhere did. They persisted with harpoons and lances, stalking seals at their holes, building snow houses on fast ice, making magic from scarcity. Was it choice? Tradition? Or just that the way they hunted worked until seas and seasons shifted around them? Climate pulses set the beat. The Holocene breathed, warmer decades, colder centuries. A lead opened one year, closed the next. Sea ice came earlier, stayed longer. Dorset camps traced margins where life was possible, then retreated. Meanwhile, something else was happening across the straits. People in boats with a different toolkit were watching the same horizon. Go forward to the Thule, surging east around 1,000 years ago, engineers of mobility. Dog teams pulled sleds over blue glare ice. Umiaks, big skin boats. Ferried families, meats and gear along the coast. They forged with iron hammered from the Cape York meteorites. Space metal, cold worked into blades and awls. With toggling harpoon heads and multi-season storage, they weren't stuck to a single niche. They moved to where the animals moved. Flexibility became the asset. What nobody knew then, as drift smoke rose from winter houses, was how paths would cross with European farmers who read the sky differently. Before that meeting, another disappearance. The Dorset fade from the record before the Norse arrive in force. Theories thread the gap. Disease carried along narrow networks. Social fracture as game routes compressed. Climate pressure that punished inflexible strategies. No single smoking gun. Just a cliff where a culture's footprints stop. Meanwhile, far south, a gambler in exile eyed a rumor. Greenland, he said, and the name stuck like bait. But hold that for a moment. Back on the coast, a micro-story. A hunter kneels at a seal's breathing hole. The wind is a blade. His mittens are caribou skin, fur-side in, frost-rimed. The line is coiled in his glove like a living thing. He waits. The lamp back home burns steady. Everything depends on this breath. This is resilience boiled down to a heartbeat. Why does this matter? Because adaptation isn't a slogan here. It's a chain of decisions that either widens options or narrows them. The Sakak found a rhythm. The Dorset perfected a craft. The Thule built a system that could pivot when the rhythm stumbled. The environment wasn't a backdrop, it was the main actor, changing lines without warning. Parallel worlds were already building bridges. Thule traders carried walrus ivory, furs, and hard-won meteoric iron along routes that stitched the Arctic together. In time, Norse iron and wood would move the other way, tucked into exchanges that left almost no paperwork, just wear marks on tools and a scatter of artifacts and middens. Two knowledge systems met at the edge of the ice. Here's the key. When climate tightens the window, cultures that can switch tools, foods, and status markers survive the squeeze. Those that can't vanish without a trace, leaving stories people still tell. In Greenland, those stories loosen time. Bells heard under glaciers. Fields that once grew hay now locked in blue. We'll test the myth soon. First, we follow the gambler who promised green. Eric the Red sold a horizon. Exiled from Iceland for killings, he sailed west, saw fjords striped with summer grass, and named the place Greenland to pull settlers into a bet. It worked. Boats followed. Families, priests, cattle, and hopes piled into two clusters. The eastern settlement, deep in fjords near today's Qaqortoq, and the western settlement farther north, smaller, more exposed. They staked fields on south-facing slopes, carved turf into walls, and cut hay where permafrost loosened its grip for a few brief months. For a while, the pulse favored them. The medieval warm period stretched growing seasons just enough. Hay meadows were scythed and stacked into winter mounds. Sheep and goats cropped the tundra. Cattle meant status. They built stone churches that still stand, roofless but stubborn. Walrus hunts funded it all. Men sailed north to Disco Bay, killed big bulls, and hauled tusks back, ivory that paid tithes to distant bishops, and bought iron, timber, and cloth from Europe. A frontier plugged into a medieval market. Prestige ran on parchment. At Valsey, a wedding in 1408 left a clean line in Icelandic records. Bishops visited. Tithes were assessed. The Norse were a European outpost, and they wanted Europe to know it. But prestige can mask fragility. Those cathedrals and seals on letters didn't feed livestock when snow came early. They didn't keep sea lanes open when pack ice pressed into the fjord mouths. Meanwhile, the climate turned. The North Atlantic cooled. Sea ice moved south, lingered longer, and pinched the shipping window. Storms deepened. Trade ships missed seasons, then years, and the market moved under their feet. Elephant ivory returned to European workshops and undercut walrus prices. The cash crop of Greenland lost shine. A thin economy got thinner. Here's the pressure point. Choices. The Norse clung to cattle because cattle signaled rank. They doubled down on hay because hay fed cattle. They kept European farming ideals in a place that punishes rigid ideals. Inuit neighbors thrived nearby with kayaks, dog sleds, seal diets, and flexible mobility. The sagas hint at contact, trading iron for furs or tusks, moments of violence, wary coexistence in narrow fjords. Archaeology shows Norse artifacts in Inuit contexts and vice versa, but the record is spare, enough to know they met, not enough to script every scene. The western settlement goes quiet first, no farewell note, no last sermon, just a gap where voices stop. Farm ruins sit with blown-in snow, and bones of cattle and caribou tell a menu that got desperate. The eastern settlement's clock ticks longer. We have that wedding record. Then silence settles there too. Abandoned churches dot hillsides, a bishop's seat empty, the letters to Iceland thin and then end. What ended them? Data draws boundaries, not a single answer. Starvation leaves rib-marked bones, but we don't find mass graves. Isolation frays resilience, but some trade trickled for decades. Storms sink boats, but not all boats. Violence with Inuit appears in fragments. not in evidence of conquest or massacre. Plague ravaged Europe. Did it ride the last ships? Maybe. Maybe not. The best we can say, multiple stresses stacked. Climate squeeze, market collapse, cultural rigidity, and bad luck until the margin vanished. Meanwhile, myths settled in like frost. Greenlanders told of bells ringing under ice, of farm fields swallowed by glaciers, so quickly people walked out with scythes still in hand. Were there literal bells entombed? Churches did stand in valleys glaciers later touched. Sound carries strangely across ice. As the island warms now, we're testing the myth in reverse. Ruins reappearing, wood and bone thawing from blue long-term storage. The echo feels real because retreat was real. There was adaptation at the edges. Zoo archaeology suggests more seals in later layers. Some households ate more fish late in the sequence. But the prestige economy didn't pivot far or fast enough. Cattle freeze. Boats rot without timber. Iron dulls without resupply. A system tuned to a milder phase lost its footing when the phase shifted. The lamp went out. The human texture matters here. Picture a winter meeting hall. Smoke caught in rafters. A priest reading Latin in a place where wind claws at the door. A mother measures dwindling hay and eyes a thin cow. A hunter weighs the shame of eating seal against the shame of hunger. They're not foolish. They're trapped by values that once worked, and by distances that punish mistakes. Their vanishing wasn't a clean disappearance. It was a slow fade. Younger people drifted. Farms consolidated, then failed. A few might have married into Inuit communities. We'll never match names to that choice, but genetics and tools hint at crossings. The last door didn't slam. It sagged off its hinges, then fell into the snow. Impact? A European outpost blinked off at the edge of the map. Europe barely noticed in the moment, but a lesson froze into the landscape. Status can kill you when the climate turns. Flexibility beats pride. The Norse read the sky wrong too long. While their churches emptied, Denmark's shadow lengthened. Claims hardened. Missions and maps would turn loss into paperwork. The empire moved in softly with trade and law. And a few centuries later, the island would host a different kind of outpost. One with runways, radar, and a plan under the ice that no one was supposed to find. While churches in Greenland emptied, pens in Europe kept moving. Greenland was tied to Norway in the medieval weave, then folded into the Kalmar Union with Denmark and Sweden, a political braid that bound kingdoms under one crown, but never fully merged identities. When the braid frayed, paperwork decided fates no ship could reach in winter. Go to 1814. Napoleon's wars shatter old alignments. The Treaty of Kiel rips Norway from Denmark and hands it to Sweden. But Denmark keeps Greenland, Iceland, and the Faroe Islands. Why? Legal scaffolding and colonial momentum. Norway's Atlantic possessions were administered by Copenhagen. That became the lever. The decision took place in warm rooms far from sea ice. Inuit families and a few Danes living on the coast had no say. Their lives shifted with a signature. Denmark tightened its hold through missions and monopolies. Royal trade companies controlled prices and routes. Missionaries preached. Schools taught Danish. And supply ships linked a scattered coast to a distant capital. Commerce and Christianization arrived braided, translating authority into food, tools, and credit. It wasn't conquest by sword. It was dependence by ledger. Norway didn't forget. In the early 20th century, as polar heroes planted flags on drifting floes, Norway reasserted interest in East Greenland, an empty space on maps in Oslo, a hunting ground, and homeland on the ground. The dispute went to the Permanent Court of International Justice. In 1933, the court ruled for Denmark. Sovereignty affirmed. Lines on a map hardened into law, and law hardened into life. For Inuit communities, those lines weren't theoretical. They determined who issued permits, who ran stores, which language carried power, and what development looked like. A net of administration settled over hunting grounds, village councils, and marriages. Greenland became a Danish colony by habit and statute, even as world wars redrew everything else. Then war forced a pivot. In 1940, Germany occupied Denmark. Greenland was cut off from its mother country. The United States stepped in, protecting Greenland's supply lines, building weather stations and preparing airfields to move planes and patrol the North Atlantic. Thule would come from that. Suddenly, an island ruled on paper became strategic terrain. Danish sovereignty survived, but American infrastructure grew on it. The map drew borders. War drew runways. Denmark emerged from occupation with its claim intact, and a new reality. Its Arctic territory was now integral to a superpower's security plan. The next chapter would bury that plan under the ice. The Cold War turned the Greenland into an unsinkable aircraft carrier. At Thule, the US carved a massive base into the tundra and ice, pointed across the polar cap at the shortest route to the Soviet heartland. The DEW line, a string of radar sites, watched the sky for bombers, then missiles. The Arctic, once a barrier, became a front line. Under that sky, a stranger experiment took shape. Camp Century, built in 1959 under the cover of science, was a city under the ice. Prefab tunnels cut into the interior's firn, powered by a small portable nuclear reactor, served by rail sleds dragging supplies from the coast. Sold to the public as polar research, it doubled as a feasibility study. Could a grid of tunnels hide a mobile missile system under moving ice? That was Project Iceworm. Here's the engineering problem. Ice isn't rock. It flows, it sags. Tunnels deform. The ceiling dripped, the floor buckled. The glacier crushed the steel arches that framed the passageways. Permanent, proved temporary in months. The nuclear reactor came out. The camp closed in 1966, leaving lumber, diesel, sewage, PCBs, and low-level radioactive residues buried where the snow kept falling. The idea of a missile grid under a living glacier died, but the waste stayed. 2 years later, Greenland learned another cost. In 1968, a B-52 on an alert mission carrying thermonuclear bombs crashed near Thule after a cabin fire. The conventional explosives detonated, scattering plutonium across the sea ice. Cleanup teams worked in brutal conditions with minimal protection by modern standards, cutting and scraping contaminated ice, shipping slush and snow to the States. Official narratives masked confusion. Workers got sick. Inuit hunters who assisted lived with the memory and the risk. Trust thinned. Danish politics collided with strategic logic. Denmark had a nuclear-free policy. The United States had flown nuclear-armed bombers in and out of Thule for years. Agreements were bent in practice to fit the pressures of deterrence. Sovereignty on paper met the needs of a superpower. Debate in Copenhagen flared, then cooled, but a seam remained. You can still feel it when Greenlandic politicians talk about base rights and the costs of hosting an empire's perimeter. Climate pulled the seam open again. The wastes sealed in 1960s snow were supposed to stay entombed for centuries, but warming accelerates melt and alters meltwater paths. Studies now warn that diesel, PCBs, and radiological residues at Camp Century could be mobilized by meltwater by the late 21st century. Not a Chernobyl under ice, but a toxic trickle that would be hard to manage in a shifting landscape. The ice remembers everything. It's starting to speak. Human lives thread through the jargon. A mechanic at Camp Century wakes to beard frost, the reactor humming a few tunnels away, while his Greenlandic neighbor crosses above with a dog team. They only sound the pads on hard snow. In 1968, a hunter sees a fireball on the horizon and feels the air vibrate. Years later, a worker coughs and wonders if it's the winter or the cleanup. The project left more than barrels and blueprints. It set a template. Science as cover, infrastructure as destiny, and Greenland as a platform others use. Yet the platform pushes back. Ice crushed strategy at Camp Century. Politics humbled secrecy after the crash. And now heat threatens to unearth what the Cold War hoped to bury for good. Meanwhile, the radar web kept thickening. Early warning systems modernized, Thul's runways lengthened, communication arrays multiplied, and missile defense plans layered over bomber-era architecture. While that was happening in the high Arctic, something else was moving through global markets. The Cold War shifted from megatons to microchips, and the metals that feed them. Rare earths, nickel, cobalt, the new weapons-grade materials began to matter as much as bombers. Greenland sits on that too. The question becomes, when the past resurfaces, who pays? If chemicals leach from Camp Century, who cleans them up? Denmark, the United States, or the self-governing island they both say they respect? If a future storm carves out a rusting drumfield, what court, what treaty, what budget answers? These are not historical hypotheticals. They're the aftershocks of strategy meeting geology. Here's the pivot. As the tunnels sagged and the reactor left, a new race accelerated. Not for missiles, but for metals lodged in ancient rock. China built processing chokeholds. The United States built lists of critical minerals. Greenland found itself at the center again, not as a runway, but as a mind map. The iceworm under the surface wasn't just nuclear, it was economic. And it's awake. Rare earths under Quantersuit promise jobs and radiation risk. China offers offtakes and processing. The USS offers security ties and funding. Greenlandic voters halt uranium, defend water, demand value at home. Melting exposes deposits and graves. Every phone, turbine, missile whispers, choose. Past wastes and buried histories rise together. Adaptation decides who stays. If this shook you, subscribe and watch our deep dive on Arctic militarization next. Comment the one question you still want answered. We tell the story's history buried for a reason.